Well, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for coming out. And I think this is an important issue for Albertans to consider. As Lila mentioned, there hasn't been any nuclear reactors ordered and built in North America for 30 years. The last time any nuclear reactor was ordered was 1978. And back east, when these reactors were built, and also in the United States, there was very little understanding about radioactive waste and about the other problems associated with nuclear power. The decision makers really thought the way I thought when I was in high school. When I was in high school, I thought nuclear energy was great because the only thing I knew about it was that it was clean, safe, cheap, and abundant. And I thought, well, who can be against that? It sounds great. And in a way, I think that what's happening here in Alberta is a little bit of a time warp. Because we seem to be back in the 50s again, where nuclear power is once again being presented as if it's this clean, safe alternative, when in fact lots of experience has shown that problems keep mounting up on the nuclear domain. As a matter of fact, as I've been trying to tell the MLAs here and other people, back east where we have 22 nuclear reactors, they're all in trouble. All of them are suffering from deterioration, which is very severe and which requires very extensive repairs. These repairs cost billions of dollars per plant. For example, in Quebec we have only one operating nuclear reactor. It costs $1.5 billion estimated. They haven't even started work on it. But just before they start work, they're saying it's going to cost $1.5 billion to repair it. And that figure is already $300 million more than it was 3 months ago. So you wonder what's happened in the last 3 months that suddenly boosted the price by $300 million. Once they get into the core of the reactor and start actually doing the work, chances are it's going to cost even more. Because in Ontario, they had 4 reactors, the Pickering A reactors, you might have heard about them. They're among those reactors that were shut down in 1997. For those of you who remember there were 7 reactors shut down at one shot by the Ontario, the Board of Directors of Ontario Hydro. Well, the 4 Pickering A reactors were among those, and 6 years later they wanted to restart them because they were not broken, they were supposed to be okay, so all we have to do is restart them, right? And the estimate was, well, we can restart them, it'll only take about 6 months to do that, and it'll cost about $800 million, about $200 million each to restart them. Well, a year and a half later, they had managed to get one of those reactors up and running at a cost of $1.5 billion. And at that point, there was an inquiry, and they said, this is unacceptable, you got to do better than that. Let's see if you can get another unit started at a cost of under $500 million, okay? Let's be a little modest here. And they brought another one up, they got another unit started up again. Again, it took almost a year to get it started, and it cost over $1 billion. So they managed to get 2 out of 4 reactors restarted at a cost of $2.5 billion, and they just wrote off the other 2. They said, forget it, we're not even going to try. So we don't really know whether these repairs, oh, and by the way, those 2 reactors that were restarted, they're not working very well. It turns out that last summer, when Ontario was really short of power, those reactors were shut down because they're having new problems, additional problems that they somehow, you know, there you go. What can you say? So we're not at all sure back east whether these reactors are really going to be able to function properly once they are refurbished, even though the refurbishment itself is very expensive. And I've been urging the MLAs here and the politicians to say, look, don't buy a Trojan horse until you see what's inside. You know, so maybe you should wait and see whether they're able to get these reactors working back east before you think about anything out here. Now, I'm going to cover a lot of territory tonight, and I apologize in advance. It's a little heavy going, but I'm trying to make it as easily understood as possible. And I'm trying to pack a lot in because I don't very often get a chance to come out here. And I think that there are many issues that are worth talking about. So I hope that you find it useful. The first, I've called this talk Nuclear Power, Hope or Hoax. Because, of course, nuclear power, there's a big public relations campaign worldwide right now to really talk up the idea of a nuclear renaissance and the idea that somehow this is going to usher in a new era of plenty. So let's talk about that first. Here we have a graph that was actually put together in 1975. That's when this graph was actually printed. And it was a graph prepared by Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory Lovins wrote a book, which is quite an important book at the time, called Soft Energy Paths. And he's the one who coined the phrase soft energy paths as an alternative to what he called hard energy paths. And what this graphic shows is the projections that were current in the United States at that time. These are US figures for the demand in energy, which just keeps going up and up and up, and requiring more and more coal and oil and gas and nuclear in order to desperately try and keep up with this galloping demand. And of course, with the oil and gas gradually being phased out due to shortage of supply, coal and nuclear would be carrying the bulk of the weight there. Now, Amory Lovins put forward an alternative vision of what might be possible, which he called soft energy paths. And he goes into great detail about this in his book, and he said that we should be aiming, instead of thinking of success as being the more energy we use, the more successful we are, the more energy we use, the richer we are. On the contrary, the less energy we use to accomplish a given task, the richer we are. It's like saying that if I go to buy something, the more money I pay for the same item, the richer I am. Well, maybe that's true, but it's pretty foolish. If you can get the same item for less money, that's efficiency, and that's what energy efficiency is all about. It's not about doing without the conveniences of energy, it's getting the maximum use out of the energy we have. And he was suggesting that we could bring this demand down so that by the year 2025, we'd be having less demand, or about the same demand, and decreasing as we were having in 1975. And he said with that goal, you can really use soft technologies, wind, solar, and geothermal, et cetera, to meet the US energy demands. And oil and gas would be phased out. Coal would also gradually be phased out, and we'd be heading towards a new vision of what our energy future would look like. Now, this dot, that yellow dot there, is in 1989, my organization, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, hosted a conference in Montreal called the Green Energy Conference. And Amory Lovins was one of our keynote speakers. And he pointed out that in 1989, in that year, we were actually well within his prediction, which at the time he published it was considered to be completely unrealistic. And so in fact, by 1989, they had already managed to shave off demand. How did this happen? Well, the reason it happened was because in 1973 was the first oil crisis. That's when there was an oil embargo, and people learned that they could actually save money by saving energy. And energy conservation did this without a lot of government leadership. There were certain incentive programs, it's true, but most of this just happened because people, by the millions, invested in energy efficiency and brought the demand down. Now, I just recently looked up these figures myself, and I found out that in 2006, you can check this on the internet, the actual demand in the US is still within that curve. So, you know, I think we should pat ourselves, this is US figures, but I think we should realize that there's been a lot accomplished, a lot more than we think, in terms of following a different path. Now, let's see where we are today. Well, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is of course the organization that won the Nobel Prize recently, set up by the World Meteorological Association and the United Nations. They're the ones who advise governments on climate change. They pointed out in March of 2007 that if you look at nuclear power, in 2005 nuclear power accounted worldwide for 16% of electricity supply. 16%. That's actually 2.7% of total energy, because of course electricity is only one slice of the energy pie. So about 2.7% of total energy. Now they said that if you invested in nuclear over the next quarter century, you could raise that figure to 18%. So nuclear could go from 16% to 18% in 25 years, a quarter of a century, much too slow in order to have any significant impact on global warming. And that's a problem. Now, they didn't say that it was too slow. They just said it can make a contribution. That's the contribution it can make. By the way, that figure is about 3% of total energy. The point I would like to make here, and I can't stress it, I can't overstress it. Nuclear power is not a solution to global warming. It is one possible contributor, and the contribution it has to make is limited. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, because I think many people are getting the wrong idea that nuclear power is some kind of magic bullet that is going to solve the problem. Not true. And by the way, climatologists and others who study this problem, they say the next 10 years are really the most crucial. That's when we really got to get a handle on this problem. We can't wait 25 years before we start making an impact. At any rate, and of course there are downsides to nuclear, which are mentioned in the report. It says safety, weapons proliferation, and waste remain as constraints. And I want to talk about those constraints in tonight's talk. What are those constraints? The safety of nuclear reactors, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the highly radioactive waste, which remains dangerous for such a long time. Now, okay, what about the alternatives? Well, the same group, the same report, talks about renewable electricity and points out that in 2005 renewable electricity was already providing 18% of world electricity, and that by the year 2025 it could be providing between 30 and 35% of world electricity. In other words, the prospects for renewable electricity, and that's existing technology, nothing that's not on the shelf right now, the prospects for renewable electricity are at least twice as good as the prospects for nuclear. Now, this is not to say that that is going to answer the problem either, but it seems clear that that this is a more viable option, a more profitable option in terms of making progress on that front than the nuclear option. That's an important thing to bear in mind, and it also has side effects. The side effects are that renewable energy generally has a positive effect in energy security, employment, and air quality. So you always have to look at the side effects. Now, I would like to use the example of Germany. I was just recently in Germany, and it's pretty interesting what's happened there in the last decade. Because of a particular political circumstance, there was a Green coalition government in Germany, and that led to an agreement to phase out nuclear power about 10 years ago. And as a result of that, Germany has 17 nuclear reactors. They've now shut down 2 of those reactors, and they're in the process of shutting down the 3rd one. And in the intervening 10 years, they have built 20,000 megawatts of wind power in 10 years. That's an amazing number. 20,000 megawatts of wind power, that's more, by far, than the entire Canadian nuclear industry. The Canadian nuclear industry is not even as much as 15,000 megawatts. And interestingly enough, when you talk about 20,000 megawatts of wind power, you don't have to wait 10 years before you get any benefit. Every year as you're building the wind power stations, you get more and more benefit. And so you reach a total of 20,000 after 10 years. With nuclear, you got to wait 10 years and you get nothing until after the 10 years or more that it takes to build the plants, and then you start getting electricity being produced. So this is an important consideration as well. As a matter of fact, when the Green coalition government was defeated in the elections and Merkel came to power, her original advice was to cancel this phase out of nuclear power. But when when her government appreciated the surplus of electricity they had from wind, they decided, oh, we'll keep on with the phase out. So they have not by any means canceled the phase out. They are persisting in it. In fact, they've reconfirmed the phase out policy. Now, I would like now to address the downsides that are identified by the working group on nuclear power. And this is really a very general talk. It's really to just give you some insight as to what one should bear in mind if you're going to embark upon this technology in a large way. And by the way, although it was mentioned that they want to build 2 reactors up at Peace River, it has been stated on numerous occasions that that's just the beginning, and that they're thinking about maybe 14 reactors. They're thinking of a whole bunch of reactors. I have to tell you that when I first moved to Quebec, I live in Montreal, When I first moved to Quebec, it was after I grew up in Ontario. I did education in University of British Columbia, postdoctoral work at University of British Columbia, and I worked in Chicago and so on. And when I went to Quebec, Hydro-Quebec at that time, this was around 1974, they were planning to build 30 nuclear reactors along the St. Lawrence River, and they were already choosing sites. They had already chosen the sites for some of these. And, you know, not one of those reactors got built. So the reason why is because the government, after reviewing the subject thoroughly and after some public process, they declared a moratorium on nuclear power reactors and didn't go that route. Now, I'm not saying that that's the same situation as here in Alberta, of course. But nevertheless, some people get the feeling that, well, you know, this is probably a done deal. You can't stop it. Don't believe that for 1 minute. This is very much ball in play. So it's a question of what are we going to do about it as Albertans or as Canadians. Now, this is a model of the uranium atom. These photographs are by my friend and colleague Robert Del Tredici, who teaches at the same college I do, Vanier College. He's an award-winning photographer, and he's the founder of an organization called the Atomic Photographers Guild, which includes photographers from around the world who have taken it upon themselves to document the nuclear age. The reason being that most people are mystified by nuclear technology, and they don't know exactly what it really means or what it really even looks like. And so these photographers try and make this invisible topic more visible through images. This is a model of the uranium atom, which is the key element in all nuclear technology, whether civilian or military. Without uranium, there wouldn't be any nuclear technology in our world. The model is at the Oak Ridge site, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they actually enriched the uranium for the first atomic bomb, the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. And the reason why uranium is so important is because it is unique among all the elements in the Earth. It's the only element which is able to undergo what's called a self-sustaining chain reaction of nuclear fission. What does that mean? Well, by the way, uranium was discovered about 200 years ago. It was named after the planet Uranus, which had been discovered around the same time. And it wasn't until World War II, however, that they found any use for uranium. And it's based upon the fact that uranium atoms can be split. And not only can one uranium atom be split, but you can split trillions of uranium atoms almost simultaneously by using what's called a nuclear chain reaction. This is a monument to the splitting of the atom. This is a monument that was built in the Soviet regime. The Soviets were great at building monumental structures of various kinds. This monument is intended to honor a man named Kurchatov, who is the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And in the background, we have a huge representation of an atom just at the moment of being split. And those semicircles, those concentric semicircles, symbolize the energy that's released when the atom is split. And of course, when trillions of atoms are split all at once, you have an atomic bomb. That's the secret of an atomic explosion. But you'll notice that there are also two small hemispheres. Those two small hemispheres are the broken pieces of the uranium atom. And they are called fission products. And that's what really constitutes the radioactive fallout from an atomic bomb. It's these fission products. And that's also what constitutes the radioactive waste from a nuclear reactor. It's primarily those fission products. Now, every time a uranium atom splits, it can split in many, many different ways. And as a result, you get literally hundreds of different types of fission products. And they have all different names, like cesium-137, or krypton-85, or iodine-131, or strontium-90. You may have heard some of these things. What are they? They're really broken pieces of uranium atoms. And they're very radioactive. They're much more radioactive than the uranium itself. Uranium itself has a relatively non-penetrating form of radiation, as I will explain later. But these things are really excessively radioactive and very dangerous, even at a distance. Now, here we have a gentleman, his name is John Hopkins, no relation to the university, and he's a weapons designer. That's his job, and he loves it. And when Bob interviewed him, and my friend Bob, the photographer, and asked him if he could take his picture, he said, well, why don't we take a picture over here beside these pictures?